Executive share schemes, Craig and James, they're often a big part of an executive's remuneration. So can you talk about some of the issues that we see and some of the things that might happen while you're overseas?
So I guess there's a few different issues here to consider. First and foremost might be shares that they'd received before leaving Australia to head overseas. There is an election that you can apply to not be taxed on any gain that you might have hypothetically made on those shares before you leave. What that means though is for those shares, they remain in the Australian tax net while you're overseas, with some exceptions depending on which country you're going to, but by and large, you'll be taxed even if you sold them while you're overseas, if you've made that election, and most people do. For employee share schemes that you've been in Australia for part of the period of vesting and part of the period you've been overseas, if that taxing point occurs, for example, while you're overseas, Australia will seek to tax you on a proportionate basis for the period that you're actually in Australia for that vesting period, so it's worth bearing that in mind. Generally, if you're working with doing your hypothetical tax and stuff like that, that will usually be brought into account, but may not always be the case, so it's just worth bearing that in mind as well. With options, it becomes even more complicated because taxing points can be different with options than they are with shares. So options are generally taxable when you actually exercise them, so there might be some value depending on your own circumstances as to when you choose to exercise options and things like that. Bearing in mind what Jane said before about hypothetical tax withholding and stuff like that, if and when you do exercise those options. And then also bearing in mind with the ESS stuff, generally executives with larger mining firms will usually have an association with a big four firm to look after their tax while they're gone. If they're involved in ESS arrangements while they are overseas, that even once they return, but they've got unvested shares from while they're overseas, those firms will continue to manage their tax affairs, even if they've been back in Australia for 2, 3, 4 years, just depending on how long that vesting period lasts after their return. So they manage the tax equalization process, but it can be a little bit frustrating, particularly if you've got an advisor in Australia that you've used for a long time prior to going overseas, that you sort of handcuffed a little bit to that firm after you've returned.